Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the third of four Petroleum Program Series that we're offering here at Drake Well Museum and Park. Tonight's program is brought to you by the Friends of Drake Well Incorporated, the American Legion Cleo J. Ross Post 368, Moody and Associates Incorporated, Range Resources, Three Rivers Desk and Derrick, and the VFW Bruce Shorts Post 5958. Our program tonight is to honor Colonel Edwin L Drake, who will be 200 this year as of Friday, March 29th, 2019. Before we begin tonight's program, I do ask that you hold any questions or comments till the end of our program, and we will answer questions and things at the end. I also ask that you silence your cell phones if you have your cell phone on you this evening. I'll give you all a moment to do that as everybody's digging. Everybody good? All right. And before we begin tonight's performance, I would like to invite Don Teeter, who is the town historian for Greenville, New York, to come up and do a special presentation. So Don, if you'd like to come up.
Good evening. My story started somewhat innocently. I got this fresh, excited voice on the phone 3 months ago, maybe.
Maybe a little longer than
Maybe
that.
a little longer ago, and just saying, here's what's happening in Titusville. Greenville has a role in this. Would you like to have a little bit of helping us out to celebrate? And I'm thinking, okay, it's a long ways. Let's see what's around. And the short story is, I'm here on a 7-hour car ride to help you celebrate the 200th birthday of Edwin Drake. So in Greenville, there's a historic marker near the center of our town, noting Drake's accomplishments, his birth date, the drilling date, and it got erected back at the Centennial, and has sat there in the last almost 60 years. It's a nice curiosity piece. It's one of the 2 markers in the whole town that mark someplace else other than Greenville that people sort of know about. One is Connecticut, where our founders came from, and the other one is this place in Pennsylvania, Titusville. And I will have a chance to make it sound real when I go back with a story here. So first, the town of Greenville extends its welcome to you, our town supervisor, town board, all of Greenville, my wife Debbie, who accompanies me here, and to other local history functions. And without any hard persuasion, I was able to have the town board of Greenville to pass the following resolution, which is to make this coming Friday Edwin L Drake in Greenville. I think the first such day that we've ever done such a thing in a real long time. And I was, I guess, eager enough that we're going to have a little speech at 11:30. We'll do a little birthday sing-along and a little birthday cake for Edwin Drake. And if anybody here wants to come up to Greenville for a 15-minute ceremony, you are all invited. All I can say is, every time I started speaking up this birthday, this light of excitement has come in Greenville, so it's going to be a good little flow over. And I have, with the help, of course, from, who wrote this?
Melissa and myself.
With help from the staff here, the town board approved this following resolution. March 29th, 2019, Greenville, New York, Edwin Drake Day. Whereas, Edwin Drake will be honored by friends and relatives on the occasion of his 200th birthday on March 29th, 2019. And whereas, he was born in Greenville, Greene County, New York on March 29th, 1819, and was a resident of this community till 1838. And whereas, he became the husband of Laura Clarissa Dowd on January 15th, 1857, and this marriage was blessed with 4 children. And whereas, in addition to being a husband and father, he was a pioneer in the modern oil industry. And whereas, he struck oil on August 27th, 1859, by drilling near Titusville, Pennsylvania. And this is good creativity here.
Thank you.
He thereby saved the whales from extinction, helped create a cheaper form of illumination, and lead to oil and natural gas being part of everything in our lives today. Now, be it resolved. That I, Paul Mackel, Town Supervisor of the Town of Greenville, New York, along with the Town of Greenville Town Board, do hereby deem it an honor and a pleasure to extend this certificate of recognition to Drake Well Museum and Park on the occasion of Colonel Edwin Drake's 200th birthday, and declare March 29, Colonel Edwin L Drake Day, in the town of Greenville, Greene County, New York, dated the 18th of March. And what a great show you have and a great museum.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Are you good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, enjoy tonight.
Tonight we honor the man credited with beginning the oil industry. We'll explore the highlights of his life, and we'll try to bring to light some of the words and thoughts as contained in the Drake Well Museum. We hope that you will leave tonight with a deeper understanding of the man and the legend. Edwin L. Drake was born on a Catskill Mountain farm on March 29, 1819 in Greenville, New York. When Edwin was 6 years old, the family moved to Vermont. Educated locally, he left home when he was 19. Like many in the 1830s, he headed west to find his fortune. He began with a position as a night clerk on a Great Lakes steamer, and the end of the season saw him at the other end of Lake Erie in Ann Arbor, Michigan, working on his uncle's farm. Having been raised on a farm, he knew the work. Edwin Bell, creator of the first Drake Memorial Museum, stated in his biography, creatively entitled Life of Colonel Edwin L. Drake, said the following: "There he spent nearly a year upon the farm, and there ended the avocation of following the plow, never again returning to the farm as a means of remunerative employment. During the first years of his struggle with the fates that guided his destiny, he, at different times, turned his ready genius in the direction of various pursuits. These varied employments gave him experience, a knowledge of human nature, and schooled him in the ways of the world to meet adversity with calm fortitude when disappointment offered discouragement in every direction." Clearly, Bell admired Drake. Drake then worked as a hotel clerk in Tecumseh, Michigan, and after a time at the old home place in Vermont, traveled to New Haven, Connecticut, where he again worked for 3 years as a dry goods store clerk. Moving to New York City, he did the same for another year and married Philina Adams in December of 1845. Because of Philina's ill health, they moved to her home of Springfield, Massachusetts, where Drake worked as an express agent on the Boston and Albany Railroad until 1849, 10 years before he drilled the well. The Drake family moved back to New Haven, Connecticut, and now Drake became a conductor on the New York and New Haven Railroad. He did indeed turn his ready genius in the direction of various pursuits. During these years, Edwin and Philina lost 2 children, and only one son, George, survived. Philina died in childbirth, March 1854. According to our historian, E.C. Bell, Drake took up his residence at the Tontine Hotel in New Haven, where he met James M. Townsend, by whom he was induced to invest $200 in the stock of the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. In this way, the railroad man was drawn into the business venture destined to make his name famous throughout the world. Early in 1857, Drake married Laura Dowd of New Haven. That summer, suffering from ill health, Drake resigned his conductor position for an offer from Townsend. Years later, in 1870, Drake wrote the following manuscript regarding the events that took place in 1857 and 59. Drakewell is most fortunate to have this manuscript written by Drake's own hand.
In December of 1857, I was employed by some parties living at New Haven, Connecticut, to go to Titusville, PA, to perfect the titles to some lands held by them, at that time by lease. At that time, there was no railroad to Titusville from Erie, and staging anything but agreeable. But as there was no other way to get there, unless I walked, so I took my seat on the stage one Monday morning for a ride of 45 miles. The road for the first 15 miles was very good, but from Waterford to Titusville, there did not seem to be much road, but rather an extensive mud hole. Although in midwinter, this we waded slowly through for 2 days, when at 10 o'clock on Tuesday night, I arrived at the now famous city of Titusville. But at that time, it was a small, dilapidated village of about 120 souls of all descriptions. The place had been settled about 60 years, and had been, and was at that time, the central point or headquarters of a heavy lumber company, Brewer, Watson and Company, which had been engaged several years in the making as well as buying of all the small dealers in the vicinity, all the lumber they could, and running it to markets below there and down to Pittsburgh. Although they converted the lumber into cash, very little of that cash ever found its way into the pockets of the residents of Titusville and vicinity, except for the members of the firm. As one man told me, he had worked for them 15 years steady for $1 a day and had only received in that time $21.50 in cash. The balance of his earnings he had received in goods from the store of the company, and those at such high prices that he was then in debt to the company, nearly $300. I merely mentioned this particular case as an illustration, showing that although the lumber company were becoming rich, the inhabitants were becoming poorer every day. And as one of the firm, Dr. F.B. Brewer, told me at that time, that he knew just how many pine trees the company owned, and about how much lumber they would make, and with their present facilities for sawing the same, it would take them about 5 years to cut up the logs and run the lumber to Pittsburgh. And said he, "We shall leave here, and the place will die a natural death. There will be no business. The people will have to move or starve, and in 10 years, the main street will be grown up to grass." And I must say, it really seemed as if it might come to that, because the grass grew in some of the streets at that time. I remained there 3 days, although my business was completed, or at least all that could be done there, in just a few hours. But the stage left for Erie early on Wednesday morning, and I must wait until its return. So to while away the time, I made all the inquiries I could concerning Oil Creek Township, Oil Creek Lake, and Oil Creek. My inquiries led to a discussion upon the properties of the oil, or whether it was an oil. And next, I doubted its coming from under the creek. Dr. F.B. Brewer immediately volunteered to pilot me to a point on the creek where it could be found without much trouble, and soon convinced me that it came from under the water. At the same time, he informed me it was his opinion, that it came from the hills on each side of the creek. But in this, I did not agree with him. I learned that it had been gathered by the inhabitants of that vicinity ever since the first settlement of the place, and from appearances, the Indians must have gathered it 100 years before that. The method adopted by the natives to obtain the oil was very simple, merely digging holes in the ground, and when they filled with oil and water, they spread a piece of flannel or woolen cloth upon the oil, which rises on the water. It's taken up by the cloth, which is then removed, and the oil is wrung out. Within 2 minutes after my arrival on the ground with Mr. Brewer, I had made up my mind that it could be obtained in large quantities by boring. As for salt water, I also determined that I should be the one to do it. But I found that no one with whom I conversed upon the subject agreed with me, all maintaining that the oil was the dripping of an extensive coal field or bed, and if so, there would be no use in boring, as the oil was near the surface. But I could not understand why it was under the creek if it came from the hills, because it is so much lighter than water, it would be impossible for it to go down of its own accord. I immediately returned to New Haven and commenced negotiations at once with the owners of the land for a lease, which was obtained without much difficulty.
Edwin Bell, in his biography, described the events as followed. Upon reaching the country and examining the property, Drake's intuitive mind quickly enabled him to determine that it would be advisable for the company to proceed at the earliest possible opportunity in arranging to drill an artesian well. Thus imbued with strong convictions, he returned to his partners enthusiastic over the prospect. There were disagreements between the stockholders in 1857, and James Townsend organized a new company, the Seneca Rock Oil Company, which hired Drake to drill.
The following spring, in 1858, with my family, I moved to Titusville. I found it a rather rough place for residence, but with my family around me, I was happy. I then began looking for an experienced borer, and although I arrived at Titusville on the 15th day of May, 1858, it was the 20th day of July before I found a man that would contract to bore a 5-inch hole 1,000 feet deep and agree to forfeit or lose pay if by his own negligence or carelessness he did not succeed in reaching that depth if necessary. For I had learned from an old salt man, or salt manufacturer rather, that many of the borers were thirsty souls and preferred whiskey to any other liquid for a steady drink, and not infrequently a hole 400 or 500 feet deep had been spoiled by the unskillful management of a drunken borer, thereby causing a loss to the owner of not only the amount paid for boring, but also the time necessary for boring another well. I was determined not to pay for any man's carelessness. I was willing to pay more than the regular price for the work, which at that time was about 75 cents per foot, the borer furnishing his own engine and tools. I finally found a man who was willing to contract to bore a round, smooth, straight, 5-inch hole, 1,000 feet deep, for $1 per foot. The borer to draw no pay, only enough to pay for the board of himself and a boy and his tobacco until the work was completed. This man was to have commenced work in July, but never made his appearance at Titusville. On the 19th of August, I started out to find my man. At that time, we traveled by private conveyance, generally on horseback, for the roads were horrid and took about 2 days to reach Pittsburgh. It was not a very desirable ride to take in hot weather. I had been over the road twice that spring and knew its difficulties. Consequently, I was not in the most amiable mood when I started for Pomeroy, Ohio, where the man belonged. I learned in Pittsburgh that he had left Pomeroy for Pittsburgh, and I never knew what became of him. I then contracted with another man who was to come on and commence operations by the 10th of September that same year. This man lived near Tarentum, PA. After waiting until the 19th and not hearing from him, I drove down to see him. I learned that he had not got along as fast as he anticipated with the salt well that he was then boring, but would be on hand shore by the 20th of October. I waited until the 17th of November, and not hearing from him, I drove down to see him. I found that he had broke a bit in the well, which was then about 425 feet deep, and he was trying to get the piece out of the well. I was then advised by my friend Louis C. Peterson, who I shall ever feel under obligation for his kindness to me at that and other times, to abandon the work for that season as it was getting late, and soon it would be stormy weather and rather an unfavorable time to commence work. So I concluded to take his advice and suspend operations until spring. I came home, built an engine house, got my engine into it, and fastened the door and set myself down very uneasy to wait for spring to open. And I did not have to wait long before it commenced opening by water, I thought, for I candidly believe it rained at least 4 days in each week all winter long. I never saw such winter weather as they have in this part of Pennsylvania. I stayed there 6 winters and had good sleighing, but one.
Living in this millennium, we don't often think how often people in the 19th century traveled. We think of the mud and the 2 days that it took to get from Erie to Titusville, and assume that once people reached their destinations, they stayed put. But with no telephones, televisions, or internet, people did travel a great deal, maybe more than some of us do today. We don't know how often Drake traveled back to New Haven to report the details of his efforts to Townsend, but we know that he did so. He wrote this beautiful letter from New Haven to his wife Laura on the occasion of his 40th birthday.
Much loved wife, I arrived here this morning at 11 o'clock. I came by the way of New York, left Castleton yesterday morn, came down the river from Albany on the steamer Hendrick Hudson. I tried to get the same stateroom you and I occupied when we went down, but could not. It was taken. You cannot imagine how lonely I was among that crowd of passengers. Captain Peck does not run the boat this season, and there was not a person on board that I ever saw. Landed in New York at 6 o'clock and went up to the Florence to breakfast. Red Mike was on hand and set my breakfast in number 8, our favorite room. But how lonely it seemed. I could hardly restrain my tears, and for the first time in my life, I was homesick. I finally looked in the glass, called myself an old fool, ate my breakfast, and came off. I did not see Mr. Sherman, but saw his wife, who seemed glad to see me. Have not seen H.L. yet, but our beloved aunt was overjoyed to see, as usual. Says she's coming to visit us next summer. She and her husband John is in town, but have not seen him. She looks as gay as a lark, but there don't seem to be any love between them. Have seen none of the company but Captain Townsend. Found your dear little short letter awaiting me in the office, where I went as soon as I landed from the cars. Dear little thing, I have learned it by heart. How I wish it were long enough to keep me reading an hour. But I was glad to get a short one and know that you are well, for you were not feeling well when I left, and I have borrowed some trouble about you. You say you conduct yourself with dignity, or endeavor to. I did not write that, wishing to place you under restraint. But I am older than you are, and have seen more of the world than you have, and know that if a married lady allows herself to be flattered by the attentions of other men than her husband, and allows things to be too familiar in conversation, or taking hold of your arm or shoulder without the lady taking notice of it, they are too apt to think they can go farther and kiss her if she is alone. It is for your own good and my own peace of mind that I warn of these things. You know, my love, that I love you better than any and everything on earth beside, and a breath of suspicion against you, although unintentionally on your part, would cause a wound in my bosom that would never heal. For my wife, I always wished to look upon, as I always have, and have always been proud to look upon her as a being as pure as ever was created. I was pleased to hear that you are getting along so well. I'm sorry that I did not tell you to write me every mail, because I shall not leave here before Friday. But write as soon as you get this to Pittsburgh. I am sorry to learn that your mother is coming away before I get back, but I shall get around as soon as possible. And now, my beloved, take good care of yourself until my return, then I will take care of you. Kiss the boys and tell them to be good children. I shall write again on Thursday. This is my 40th birthday.
This is my 40th birthday, and I am sorry that I cannot impress upon it the news upon your dear lips, and your affectionate husband, Edwin.
Traveling back to Titusville, Drake continued trying to find a driller to complete the work begun. In his 1870 manuscript, Drake wrote the following.
In 1859, I received a letter from my good friend Peterson, who I had kept up a correspondence with, that he had found me a man, one that would suit me precisely. He could recommend him, as he had been in his service several years. I immediately went to Tarentum and was fortunate enough to secure the services of a Mr. W.A. Smith, and I could not have suited myself better if I had had a man made to order. We had some small jobs of work on hand, which he thought would take about 4 weeks to finish up, and he thought best to make a set of tools before he left Tarentum, because he had all the necessary tools for manufacturing them. I immediately procured the necessary iron and steel and left him to follow on the 1st of June. As soon as we arrived at Titusville, which I think was on the 9th, we commenced.
From June 9th until August 27th, they drilled. Exactly how many different people worked on the well is not known. With Brewer and Watson lumber mills so close, it's likely that many did so. Many hands would have been needed to raise the derrick and to build the buildings. Perhaps some learned to drill from Uncle Billy, or just visited and so helped him pass the time and ease his boredom while he drilled endlessly. The Seneca Rock Oil Company, meanwhile, had decided that they had spent enough money on the venture and stopped giving Drake any financial aid, including his promised pay. His Titusville friends, Peter Wilson and R.D. Fletcher, both loaned Drake money to help him carry through. Peter Wilson, seen here on the left, was a pioneer to this region and served the community as a druggist. This quiet and retiring man sold his store after the beginning of the oil industry and became an oil producer. He, like Drake, later suffered ill health and lived the rest of his days near the Woodlawn Cemetery. Reuel Danforth Fletcher operated a dry goods and carpeting store from 1855 until his death. Fletcher's store was the only establishment in Titusville where Drake could order foodstuffs on credit. Fletcher, a wise businessman, later sold oil field pipe and was a large stockholder in the Titusville and Pithole Plank Road. He served as Titusville's first auditor and was actively involved in municipal affairs. Upon hearing of Fletcher's death, Laura Drake wrote to her friend E.C. Bell, "I regret Mr. Fletcher has passed to the life eternal. He was our best friend socially and financially." Drake's major achievement was developing the use of the drive pipe. The soft, sandy soil with the high water table made digging to bedrock impossible. Drake acquired the pipe and directed that it be pounded down to the bedrock 36 feet deep. Then he drilled through the pipe and hit oil at another 33.5 feet. If he had patented the idea, he probably would have died a very rich man, and this perhaps was his greatest gift to the oil industry. The well produced about 80,000 gallons in 1859. A second well was drilled later, and Drake continued to report to Mr. Townsend in Connecticut, as in the following letter.
To friends Bowditch and Townsend, your telegrams just received. I have been down sick and will have the oil shipped out on Tuesday, as I cannot get cars before that time. I will come to New Haven as soon as possible. Don't get too excited over anything you hear. Our second well is a good one. Yours sincerely, E. L. Drake.
Drake traveled to Pittsburgh to market the second batch of oil to Samuel Keir. Keir, the first refiner of petroleum, had been selling oil as a medicine since the 1840s, and then refined the crude into kerosene. Of course, Drake's travels took him back to New Haven, Connecticut, where he wrote the following letter to his wife Laura. Though we don't know much about the people mentioned, the comments give valuable insight into Drake's personality.
My darling wife, I have been over to Guilford today. Went up to Mr. Chittenden's and took dinner, then took one of Mr. Chittenden's horses and carried Mary over to the head and took with Mother and Kate. They were surprised and seemed pleased to see me. Everything went off well until the last 10 minutes when your mother told me that she had $100 in New Haven and she had not had time to go after it, or she would have had it there so that she could have sent out the money she owed you. I was sorry she should make any such remark, but I know she cannot help it, so I made no reply. Don't you think that's the best way? Mary looks very well and anticipates a great deal of pleasure in housekeeping. They think they will get into their house next. Henry has gone into the butchering business and is doing well. He serves the Madison folks with meat as well as the Guilford people. Eddie is a smart child, but not good looking. Though I don't know if I ought to have told you that, for Mother Chittenden thinks she looks very much like you. The old swamp angel. She did it to plague me. I told her I should need specs to see a fate and resemblance, but then I thought it would be doubtful. She told Mary, of course, that she was not as good looking as Fred. I felt provoked at the old Arab. Kate was glad to see me. She mounted into my lap and sat and ran her fingers through my hair, just as you used to do, for half an hour. I felt as if I would have given half of my fortune if you had been there. We should all have been so happy. I'm almost homesick tonight, and my stomach is so badly out of order that I shall take some pills. I hope Mr. Ives will get back tomorrow so that I can go home. I want to see my beloved wife and children. Excuse me from writing anymore, as I feel too sad and miserable. I hope to get a letter from the best of wives in the morning. Pray for me, my dear, and believe me, your true and loving husband. Kiss the boys for me. Edwin.
While living in Titusville with his growing family, Drake purchased land from Jonathan Watson, which he later sold at a significant profit. He was elected Justice of the Peace in 1860. This marriage certificate from the Drake collection bears his signature. The great rush for leases and purchases of oil lands required a great deal of legal work, some of which was performed by our dear Colonel. He also continued to sell oil on a commission basis.
E.B. Bowditch, Esquire, dear sir. Below, please find the quantity of oil shipped from the works in the month of November. L.B. and Company, 95 barrels, 3,700 gallons. E&B, 94 barrels, 3,700 2 gallons. Liddell and Marsh, 1 barrel, 40 gallons. A.L. Leonard, 1 barrel, 40 gallons. Nothing new transpired since your agent left. Sincerely yours, E.L. Drake.
Drake left Titusville in 1863 with $15,000 to $20,000 in his pocket. He ventured to New York City and engaged in oil speculation as a stockbroker, but lost everything. His health declined. E.C. Bell described his illness as neuralgic affliction of the spine. Perhaps it was an early form of multiple sclerosis, or maybe degenerating discs. We'll never know. The family moved to Vermont, then to the seashore of New Jersey. The Drake family had virtually no income and lived in dire poverty. Laura Drake took in sewing to support the 4 children, the invalid husband, and herself. In 1866, Drake made a plea to his old Titusville friend, Peter Wilson.
My old friend Wilson, if you have any of the milk of human kindness left in your bosom for me or my family, send me some money. I am in want of it, sadly, and am sick. Yours fraternally, E.L. Drake.
Concerned citizens of Titusville, which included friends Wilson and Fletcher, sent the Reverend Henry Purdon to eastern Pennsylvania to investigate the state of the Drake family. Purdon reported back as follows: I found them, as I supposed, without any of the comforts of life and living on the bare floor. I was obliged to solicit a night's lodging of a neighbor, there not being any hotel or tavern within 5 miles of the place. I am sure the picture of Colonel Drake's home would open the heart of anyone who has a soul to do good. When I spoke to the colonel about there being snow in Titusville for sleighing, he exclaimed with tears in his eyes,
Thank God we have not had much cold weather here. What will we do without fuel, and my children's shoes worn out, and comparatively nothing in the locker? And I am a cripple. What will we do if we have a very cold winter?
When Drake received no response, he again pleaded for help.
Friend Wilson, For God's sake, send me some money. I am in want of some. I have been sick most of the time since I was out here. I need money to pay board for my family. Direct to me, 59 Liberty Street, New York, as before. Yours fraternally, E. L. Drake.
Periodically, friends would send money to the Drakes, but that was not enough. The Titusville oil community held 2 meetings, November 30th and December 2nd, 1869, in an attempt to raise money to help the destitute founder of the oil industry. $4,200 was forwarded to Mrs. Drake to care for the family.
R.D. Fletcher, Esquire. Dear Sir, yours of the 10th containing 2 drafts of $100 each is received. I assure you, this was a godsend, as I have been confined to the house and yard since November 19th with an almost useless leg and foot, and being short of fuel, have suffered somewhat with cold and such. Permit me to thank you and all those who have so kindly remembered me in my affliction. Respectfully yours, E. L. Drake.
In 1870, Mrs. Drake moved the family to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, on the advice of a physician. Some old friends in the oil industry continued to keep track of the family and began to petition the Pennsylvania legislature to provide the founder of the profitable industry with a pension. This was granted in 1873, and this is how part of the document reads. And whereas the said E. L. Drake expended large sums of money in prosecuting his search for petroleum, and by season of disaster to his fortune, an unfortunate loss of health in his labor and exposure from the said search for petroleum, he was not able to derive any benefit from it, and is now in indigent circumstances and helpless from disease, and therefore unable to provide for the wants of his family, consisting of a wife and 4 children. Now, therefore, Drake would receive $1,500 a year, and Laura, if she survived him and remained a widow, would continue to receive the same. Drake died 7 years later, on January 8, 1880, and was buried in Bethlehem. His obituary stated, "All who knew him, and there are many such in this community, will rejoice that at last his pain is over, but they will sadly miss the genial, intelligent gentleman who, in pain himself, made others happy, and by his cheerful view of life preached every day a powerful sermon on contentment, patience, and trust in God. He fell asleep last evening, age 61, 7 months and 10 days. May he rest in peace." As early as 1868, some in the oil region campaigned for a monument to Drake. In 1881, a meeting was held at the Titusville Oil Exchange focused on the monument idea. A statue of Drake was the preferred choice. Unfortunately, the project fell by the wayside in spite of some money having been raised. Even the Emery family, who owned the site of the Drake well, thought of erecting a bust of Drake on the well. Work began on the foundation of a monument in Woodlawn Cemetery in 1900. Drake's remains were exhumed and moved to Titusville, and the monument was attended by all the oil men and Laura Drake on October 4th, 1901. About 10 years later, E.C. Bell began building the Drake Memorial Museum to house his growing collection of documents and artifacts of the early oil industry, which he had amassed over the years. Among his many writings, Bell carried on an active correspondence with the widowed Laura Drake. On November 7th, 1918, Mrs. Laura Drake wrote this letter to the man mainly responsible for the efforts to honor the founder of the industry that now fuels the world.
Dear friend, your letter of October 29th received telling me the chair had arrived at the station. Did it come in good order, as I did not see it after it was crated for shipment? I hope you took off the linen covers and discarded them. I was ill in bed at the time and could not see to it. The chair was in our storage closet. I am pleased to have the chair placed in the museum as a memorial. Colonel Drake did start to write a biography. It only amounted to a few pages of fodderall, which I did not feel like giving up at present. I have so little of my husband's handwriting. I have just a few things, like his pocketbook that he carried, spectacles, and such. If they would be of any interest, I might find. Tomorrow, the 8th, will be the 33rd anniversary since his death occurred. It seems like twice that to me. I hope for your success in making the Memorial Museum what you desire it should be. Possibly someday I may visit it, as it would give me sweet pleasure. I am very well after a tedious cold. Thanking you for your interest shown. I am very grateful. Laura C. Drake. Well, thank you all for attending tonight's performance this evening. And I would like to have you all join us in honoring Colonel Edwin L Drake. And I'd like you to join us in singing Happy Birthday to the dear Colonel. So if you are ready.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Colonel. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Any questions at all?
How did he acquire Colonel? Was he in the military or?
He was not an actual colonel. Mail was sent to him to Titusville addressed to Colonel Drake to enhance his status within the community. And it's a strategy that worked. His employers addressed mail, and when he first arrived at Titusville, Colonel Drake, you have mail, and that started it, and it really worked.
How did he refine the oil first? What was the oil refined?
Kerosene. The oil, the main reason for him drilling to kerosene, to produce kerosene to save the whales from extinction. That's a true story. Because previous to that, whale oil was used for illumination, and then they could use kerosene, clean burning kerosene, in their oil lamps.
It was iron wax, wasn't it? Was there anything done with that or when?
Not in the beginning, no.
Any other questions? Did y'all get a cupcake? Go ahead.
Can I ask you the gasoline, if they also distilled it and just throw it out? Because they said it was.
At first they did. There was no use for it. The internal combustion engine had not been invented yet. So there was a lot of wasted byproducts.
Now, I observed I guess a photograph of here of a Penn oil refining company. My grandfather started to work for the South Penn Oil Company in 1917. He stayed there for 30 years.
Wow. That's interesting.
And I was wondering, would that be the same refining company? No, that was down in Pittsburgh.
I can't answer that.
No, it's not. South Penn Oil was the producing arm for Standard Oil,
Okay,
so they were a production company
okay.
owning thousands of acres in western Pennsylvania, New York State, and West Virginia.
Yeah, because I used to go with him when I was a child, and he would go to the old one-cylinder steam engine, and he had to shut them down, lubricate them, and then he would get on the flywheel. He'd jump on the flywheel to get it moving again.
Yep, that's a production company. Yeah, the other Pennsylvania refining back there became Penn's Oil, and that's refining.
Okay.
But South Penn eventually buys them and has the controlling interest, so.
Where did your
It's all confusing.
grandfather work?
Where did he work?
Yes.
It was in, southwestern Pennsylvania, southwest of Pittsburgh.
Yes.
Was that the company that Ida Tarbox went after?
Standard Oil, yes.
There was a division in Pittsburgh?
South Penn, the big boys knew by, after the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1884, they knew that the time was limited for their reign. So after that act, every time they started a new company, they started it as a separate company.
Was she in the area at that time? She was a graduate, I believe, of Allegheny College
Right. Yeah. So she was out of Titusville by
at that
then.
time.
So South Penn Oil was started as a separate company. The National Transit Pipeline was a separate company. Eureka Pipeline, Bradford Transit Pipeline, Buckeye Pipeline, all were separate companies, but they were all owned by the same guys.
That was probably as famous a woman as Colonel Drake was.
Yeah, I can remember, I was about 4 or 5 years old, he would walk outside on the porch in the morning, and he would listen. And he could name each one of the wells by the way it sounded. And he would say, number 7's not running.
Huh.
So that would be the first one he would go to.
You need to come back in the summer and hear our barker. We have a barker in our gas
Oh,
engine
okay.
also.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's really special that Don and Debbie came all the way from Greenville to share with us this evening. It's nice to have somebody from the hometown.